You are made of iron, not because you chose it, because the forge chose you. Because your father's father worked it, and his father before him, and somewhere in the long, wordless line of Blackwell men, it was decided that this would be your inheritance. Not land, not gold, heat, smoke. The weight of a hammer in your hand before you were old enough to understand what weight meant. Your name is Edmund Blackwell. You are 28 years old. You live in the village of Ashford, in the heart of England, in the year of our Lord 1340. You wake before the sun finds the edge of the hills. You eat what your wife leaves on the table without meeting her eyes. You walk the same path through the same mud every morning, past the same market stalls and the same faces and the same smell of livestock and rain. And you arrive at the forge before the birds have fully decided whether or not to bother singing. You are a man of few words and many observations. You notice things, the way iron changes color under different temperatures, from black to deep red to the orange, that means it is almost ready, all the way to the white heat that means it has become something different from what it was. You have learned to read those changes quickly, with a precision that comes from years of attention. You have applied this same precision to everything in your life. You read people the way you read metal. You look for what is just beneath the surface, and you keep what you find to yourself. For a long time, that was enough. Or at least, you had convinced yourself it was. The forge of Harwick Dunmore sits at the junction of Ashford's two busiest roads, between the market square and the royal stables, a position that has made Harwick not only a wealthy man, but a necessary one. Every horseshoe nailed to every noble's mount in the county has passed through his fire. Every hinge, every lock, every iron gate that makes the powerful feel protected was shaped in this building. Merchants come to him. Knights come to him. Even the Earl's household sends riders when something needs to be made right. And you, Edmund, are the reason most of it is worth anything. You have been Harwick's best craftsman since you were 16 years old, and you both know it. And neither of you has ever said it aloud, because that is not how things are spoken between men like you. You know the forge the way you know your own hands. Every crack in the stone floor, every sound the bellows make when they need tending, the particular voice of the east-facing chimney in a south wind. You know the exact angle at which the morning light comes through the window above the door and turns the smoke golden for perhaps 12 minutes before the sun rises high enough to ruin it. Y'all have mapped this place in your bones. What you did not know, in all those years, was that the forge would one day hold something more than iron. Aldric Thorne arrived 3 years ago on a Tuesday in October, in the rain. You remember the rain, because it had been raining since Sunday. And everyone in Ashford was tired of it, and tired of each other. And the mood in the village had soured like milk left too long in summer. The road was ankle-deep mud in places. A cartwheel had buried itself near the well, and the argument over whose responsibility it was to free it had been ongoing since dawn. And then there was Aldric in the doorway of the forge. Travel bag over one shoulder, hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, and a grin on his face that seemed completely, bafflingly unbothered by any of it. You watched from your station as Harwick looked him over. Harwick had been interviewing men all week. The last assistant had left for his cousin's farm in the north, and he had turned away 3 candidates with the particular efficiency of a man who knows what he wants and will not be sold something else. Aldric was 31, though he looked younger when he laughed, which you would learn was often. Broad shoulders, fair hair that, once it dried, fell in loose waves around a face that was open and unguarded in a way you found immediately suspicious, because in your experience, people with faces like that were usually hiding something, and the ones who weren't were naive, and naive people made your work harder. His hands were already calloused, years of northern smith work, evident in the way he carried them, with a slight outward curl of the fingers that comes from a lifetime of gripping heavy tools. He had a wife and 2 small children waiting for him in lodgings he'd arranged in the village before he even knocked on the door. That detail told you something important about him. He didn't walk into situations hoping for the best. He planned. He committed. He did not knock on doors he wasn't prepared to walk through. Harwick hired him on the spot. That was unusual enough that you noted it. And just like that, the forge that had always held 2 men, you and Harwick, master and craftsman, each knowing his place, became something with 3 corners, and you had not yet begun to understand what shape 3 corners could form. The first weeks, you kept your distance. That was simply your nature. You are not a man who opens easily, Edmund. You never have been. You were the kind of child who observed a room before entering it, who chose his words with the care that other children gave to choosing sweets. Your wife, Margaret, calls it coldness. And she is not entirely wrong, though she's not entirely right either. There is a difference between coldness and caution, and you have always understood that difference better than she does, because she has never had to be truly, carefully guarded. She has always been exactly what she appears to be. You have not. Aldric was the opposite of guarded. He was constitutionally incapable of it. He filled every silence in the forge with something. A story, a question, a song half remembered from a village 3 counties north. He knew the names of everyone in Ashford within a fortnight, and somehow, inexplicably, their business as well. Who owed whom what, whose mother was unwell, who had a new foal, which merchant was likely to shortchange you if you didn't count your change twice. He possessed a gift for people that you found simultaneously exhausting and mesmerizing, like a fire that is too close to be comfortable, but impossible to stop watching. You told yourself you were simply observing. You were assessing the new worker. That was natural, professional. But you noted things you had no professional reason to note. The way he worked, for instance, not just efficiently, though he was efficient, but with a kind of absorption in the craft that reminded you of something you had once felt yourself, years ago, before routine had worn it smooth. He worked the way people work when they have chosen their trade, rather than simply arrived at it, with the pleasure of someone doing exactly what they are built for. You noted the way he spoke to Harwick, with respect, but without fear. That was rare. Most men were afraid of Harwick, even men who had known him for years. Aldric treated him like a man, rather than a monument, and Harwick, without ever acknowledging it directly, seemed to sit slightly differently in his presence. Something almost imperceptibly loosened, and you noted, in the careful, disciplined catalogue of your attention, the way he sometimes looked at you when he thought you were occupied elsewhere. Not a long look, just a glance, but with something in it that had weight. You did not know what to do with that. So you did nothing. For weeks and then months, you did nothing. But you noted it. You couldn't help noting it. Harwick Dunmore had turned 52 that autumn, and there was a heaviness to him that winter that had not been there the year before. His wife Eleanor had died in the spring, a fever, rapid and merciless, the kind that gives no warning and no real time for goodbyes. He had buried her on a Tuesday and returned to work on Wednesday. and no one in the village had dared speak of it to him directly, because no one spoke to Harwick about things he hadn't invited discussion of, and he had made his wishes in this matter clear through the simple force of returning to normalcy, as though Eleanor's absence were a logistical matter rather than the end of a 30-year marriage. He was a large man, Harwick, not simply tall, though he was that 6 foot and some additional inches, with a chest like a barrel and shoulders that still filled a doorframe despite his age. He had the body of a man who had done physical labor every day of his adult life, and that kind of body does not leave quietly. His beard was gray now, more than dark, and the lines around his eyes had deepened since the spring, but his hands at the anvil were still the most assured you had ever watched. When Harwick brought his hammer down, the whole forge seemed to acknowledge it. You respected him. You were also, in the quiet and honest part of yourself, a little afraid of him. Not physically, never physically. Afraid in the way you are afraid of someone who sees more than they let on. Harwick had the eyes of a man who had looked at the world for 52 years and reached certain conclusions that he was keeping to himself, and there were moments when you felt those eyes on you and had the uncomfortable sense that whatever he was concluding, some part of it concerned you specifically. He said almost nothing that winter. He worked. He went home to the empty house on the edge of the village. He came back and worked again. And in the silence of his grief, the forge somehow became quieter too, as though it understood, as though the fire itself was showing respect. Spring came, and with it, a commission large enough to change the pace of everything. The Earl's son was to be married in June, and the ironwork contract, hinges, fixtures, decorative gates, ceremonial fire tools for the new estate had gone to Harwick, which meant it had gone to all 3 of you. You worked from before dawn until after dusk, through April and May, and the heat inside the forge was relentless, the kind of heat that pushes through every pretense and leaves you with nothing but what is essential. Something changed in those weeks, though you did not understand it fully until later. When you are tired enough, when your body is engaged enough, the careful constructions of the mind begin to come apart. You cannot maintain walls when your arms are occupied. And so, without attending it, without deciding to, you began to let things through. You stopped noticing that Aldric talked too much. Or rather, you started actually hearing what he was saying. He talked about his children, and the way he spoke of them told you something about the kind of father he was. Not the broad-stroke pride that men used in public, but specific things, details that only someone paying close attention would know. The lisp his eldest had developed at 4 and then lost overnight. The way his youngest hoarded smooth stones, which she lined up along the windowsill every evening and reorganized every morning. He talked about these things not to perform fatherhood, but because they were simply part of the texture of his life. And he lived in the texture of things rather than above it. He talked about the North, about his apprenticeship there under a smith named Wulfric, who had been brilliant and brutal in equal measure, who had taught him more about iron in 3 years than most men learned in a decade, and who had also had a way of making Aldric feel small that he had spent years working to unlearn. I still catch myself shrinking sometimes, he said one evening, as you both worked a set of decorative scroll work. When someone raises their voice, even if it has nothing to do with me. He said it without self-pity, simply as information. An observation about himself delivered with the same plainness he gave to observations about the weather. You did not respond, but you listened. You listened in a way you rarely listen to anyone. one afternoon toward the end of May, while Harwick was meeting with the Earl's steward about the delivery schedule, and the two of you had the forge to yourselves for an hour. Aldric looked up from the piece he was shaping and said, without particular preamble, "You've been different lately. You set down your tongues. Different how?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things, looking at you with those eyes that always seemed to be taking in slightly more than the available surface. "Less like a wall," he said. You didn't respond. The fire popped and settled. "I mean that kindly," he added, and something in his voice made it difficult to doubt. "You keep a great deal in, Edmund. I've noticed it since the beginning. Most men do keep things in to some extent, but it's different with you. It's deliberate. It costs you something. Most men are guarded. Most men are careless, actually." He tilted his head. "They think they're guarded, but they spill themselves everywhere without noticing. Trust me, I've been one of those men more times than I'd like to count." A small, self-deprecating smile. "But you choose what you show and what you don't. Every word is selected. I can see it sometimes, when you think no one is watching." The village outside was quiet. Through the open door came the smell of hay and the distant lowing of cattle. The fire breathed between you. "What do you think you see?" you asked. And the question surprised even you as it came out. Aldric was quiet for a longer moment than was comfortable. He looked at the piece of ironwork in his hand, then at you. "Someone who is more," he said, "than what he allows himself to be." You held his gaze for a moment that felt, in the way certain moments do, longer than its actual length. And then Harwick's footsteps sounded on the path, and you both returned to your work with the practiced ease of men resuming something that had never been interrupted. But it had been interrupted. And the thing that interrupted it did not go back to wherever it had come from. You began to understand, in the weeks that followed, that you had been lonely for a very long time. Not the loneliness of solitude. You had a wife, a household, neighbors, a church to attend on Sundays, a village that knew your name and your trade and the broad outlines of your life. You were, by any ordinary measure, embedded, not alone. But there is a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with the number of people around you. It is the loneliness of having an interior life that no one has ever been allowed to fully see, of carrying something inside yourself that has never had a name you were willing to say aloud, because you understood, at an age too young for such understanding, that some names are dangerous, that some truths, spoken plainly, bring consequences that you cannot walk back from. England in 1340 was not a gentle place for men who felt what you felt. The church had words for it. The law had words for it. Men had been ruined for far less than the truth. For rumor, for association, for a letter, for a look. You had known since you were a boy that you needed to be careful. And you had been careful. And you had built the walls that Aldric had noticed, and those walls had kept you safe, and also, you were only now beginning to understand, had kept you completely alone. So you had married Margaret, who was kind enough and distant enough, and who had long ago seemed to accept that. Your marriage was a practical arrangement dressed in Sunday clothes, and you had poured everything you could not say into your work. And you had been, if not happy, then functional. And then Aldric Thorne had arrived in the doorway, on a rainy Tuesday with his ridiculous grin and his calloused hands, and his attention that was different from anyone else's attention you'd ever known. And something in the locked room of yourself had started quietly to stir. If you're listening to this story right now, we want to know where you are. Tell us in the comments. What city? What country? Someone is listening in a room across the world tonight, and you are not as far from each other as you think. Let us know you're here. June arrived, and the commission was delivered, and the Earl's household sent word of their satisfaction, which Harwick relayed in his typically understated way by simply not mentioning it at all. The three of you had worked a full spring together, and the rhythms between you had settled into something comfortable. Harwick's authority, unquestioned. Aldric's lightness, the counterweight to the forge's inherent gravity, and you as the thread between them, steady and precise. But something had shifted, and you felt it every day. You had started to speak more, not much more. That was not your nature. But where before you had given single-word answers to most questions, you now occasionally offered a sentence, a thought, an observation that was yours rather than merely functional. Aldric received each of these with the same quality of attention, never making a thing of it, never over-responding, simply accepting the words as they came and handing something back. It was the most natural conversation you had ever had in your life. And it was also the most terrifying. There was a morning in early July when you were working side by side on a set of door hinges. Repetitive work, the kind that does not demand your full attention. And Aldric began, without preamble, to talk about the night his youngest was born. The winter had been hard. The midwife nearly didn't arrive in time. His wife had been frightened, and he had been terrified in a way he had not allowed himself to show to anyone present. He had stood in the next room, gripping the windowsill and saying things to himself in a low voice. Prayers or commands or something in between. And it had been fine. It had been fine. The baby had come and been healthy and screaming and perfect. But the memory of those hours had never fully left him. "I've never told anyone that," he said after a moment. "The fear part. Why not?" He gave you a sideways look that contained a kind of shared understanding. "Men don't." "No," you said. "They don't." A pause. The hinges cooled on the bench between you. "What are you afraid of, Edmund?" he asked. Quietly, without pressure. The way he asked everything, as though the question were an open door and you could walk through. It or not, and either choice would be respected. You had the deflection ready. You had always had deflections ready, but they sat unused. "Being seen for what I am," you said. He didn't ask what you meant. He simply nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when they hear a thing they already understood but needed to hear spoken aloud. And then the hinge needed turning, and the forge resumed its ordinary sounds, and neither of you pushed further. But the words were in the air now. They had been said. There was no one saying them. Harwick noticed. Not with obvious signs. He was never a man of obvious signs. But in the way he sometimes paused before speaking to one of you. The way his gaze moved between you at certain moments with an expression you could not quite parse. The way he occasionally said something that seemed to belong to a different conversation than the one you were ostensibly having. One evening in late July, as you were banking the fire for the night, he stood at the window, looking out at the darkening village, and said, to no one in particular, "The hardest thing in this life is knowing your own heart." Then he put on his cloak and left without another word. You and Aldric looked at each other across the cooling forge. "What do you suppose he meant by that?" Aldric asked. "I don't know," you said. It was the first time in months you had said something in the forge that was clearly untrue. August came on hard and bright, the heat pressing down on Ashford like a flat hand. The forge in August was almost brutal. The three of you stripped down to as little as decency allowed. There was no choice in it. The heat demanded it. Survival demanded it. And you worked in a near silence that was, paradoxically, more communicative than any conversation. There is something about extremity that strips pretense. Heat, labor, exhaustion. They take things from you that you think you own, but actually only borrow. And in those long, August days, with the fire and the sweat and Aldric 3 feet away from you for 8 and 10 hours at a stretch, things that you had been categorizing as nothing began to insist on being something. You noticed his hands constantly. You had always had a professional attention to hands. The nature of your work trained it into you. You assessed hands the way a farmer assesses weather, automatically, without effort. But your awareness of Aldric's hands had moved entirely out of the professional. You noticed them the way you noticed things you were trying not to want. He had a habit, when he was concentrating on a difficult piece, of pressing his lips together very slightly. A small and specific thing. You should not have known it. You knew it. When he laughed, the full, unguarded version, the one that happened at least twice a day regardless of circumstances, it did something in your chest that had no name in any language you had access to and no safe place to be put. One afternoon, you passed him a piece of work at the precise moment he reached for it, and your hands overlapped on the metal. Just a second, not even a full second. A collision of knuckles, warm from the work, unplanned by either of you. You both pulled back immediately. You did not look at each other. The silence that followed lasted 4 heartbeats. "Right," said Aldric, and went back to work. You stood for a moment with your hands at your side, feeling the place where his had touched yours, and you understood with a clarity that was both terrible and clarifying that what you were experiencing was not going to be managed into nothing by willpower alone. You did not sleep well that week. You lay beside Margaret in the dark and watched the ceiling and ran calculations. The risks were not abstract. They were specific, legal, social, final. The church had positions. The law had punishments. You had spent your entire adult life navigating the existence of what you felt by, ensuring that what you felt never touched anything real, never moved from the interior room into the visible world. But the interior room had been visited now. Someone had knocked, and you had let them in without fully deciding to. And now the question was what to do with what lived there. You thought about Aldric's wife, his children, the stone-lined windowsill with his daughter's collection of river pebbles. You thought about Margaret and her particular form of resignation. You thought about Harwick and what he might know, what he might do. And then, when morning came, you walked toward the forge and found that something in your chest was already there ahead of you. The cautious man in you recognized this as a problem. The rest of you could not find it in itself to care. You began arriving earlier, by a few minutes at first, then by a half hour. The forge cool and dark when you got there, the fire needing to be built from nothing. And without any arrangement between you, Aldric started arriving earlier too, until there was a stretch of that late August when the two of you were in the forge together before Harwick most mornings, working in the low first light, speaking in voices quieter than the work required. You talked about your fathers, both dead, both men of their generation, both people whose emotional vocabulary had been limited to the necessary minimum. You talked about what it felt like to be handed a craft without being asked whether you wanted it, and the strange process of deciding, as a grown man, that you were glad it was yours after all. He told you about a river near his childhood home where he used to go when he needed to be alone, and the way the water sounded in November, and how he had never described it to anyone before because there was no one he had ever wanted to describe it to. You told him that you had a habit since boyhood of going up to the roof of whatever building you were in and looking out at the dark when you couldn't sleep, and that there was something about height and openness in the middle of the night that reset something in you that daytime couldn't touch. He listened to this as though it were the most interesting thing he had heard in weeks. One morning, in the gray light before the fire was fully lit, he said, "Do you ever think you were born in the wrong time?" You looked at him. He was not looking at you. He was looking at the embers, his forearms resting on the edge of the anvil, his expression something between thoughtful and tired. "Yes," you said. He nodded once, slowly, as though that single word had confirmed something he had been carrying a question about for a long time. And then Harwick arrived, and the day began, and the world went on about its business, indifferent and enormous. While inside the forge, the space between you had become something that neither of you could pretend any longer was ordinary. The day it changed was a Friday in late August. Harwick was called to the manor of Lord Cavendish, a new commission, substantial enough that he had dressed in his better clothes before leaving, which he did rarely. He gave you and Aldric their instructions for the day and walked out in the mid-morning, his broad back disappearing up the road toward the manor house. And then there was silence. The kind of silence you had not had before. Not the silence of both of you being busy. Not the silence of restraint or performance. Just silence. The village about its Friday business, the market pulling people toward the square, and the two of you in the forge with the fire burning, and no particular audience for whatever was about to happen. For the first hour, nothing. You worked, the ordinary sounds of the forge. You were both aware of the fact of the empty afternoon in a way that expressed itself as slightly too much concentration on the work, slightly too precise a focus on what your hands were doing. But the ordinary thins out in certain conditions over time. It was Aldric who stopped first. He set down his hammer and stood very still for a moment, not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of a man who is deciding something. And then he looked up at you, directly, without the usual lightness in his face, without the ease that was his default, just him, looking at you, and something in the look that was the most honest thing you had seen from another person in years. "Edmund," he said, "just your name. Just your name." But it landed with the weight of everything that had been building since that October Tuesday in the rain. You set your tools down slowly, deliberately. The fire breathed. Somewhere in the stables across the road, a horse moved in its stall. The market sounds reached you faint and distant, as though from another world. "I know," you said. He exhaled, long and slow, the way you exhale when you have been holding something for months. "This could take everything," he said quietly. Not an argument, a naming of facts, the way you name a flaw in a piece of metal before deciding whether it can be worked around. "Our work, our families, everything we've built here. I know. If anyone were to know, I know all of it," you said. His eyes stayed on yours. And yet, you said. He crossed the forge toward you. What happened then was not dramatic in the way that songs insist upon. There were no declarations, no speeches, just the reality of him close enough that you could see the amber the fire put into his eyes, close enough that the smell of his work and the particular warmth of him were no longer abstract. And his hand came up to the side of your face. carefully. The way you hold something when you are not certain it is real. The rough of his palm against your jaw, and you did not flinch. You had been afraid you would flinch. You did not. His forehead came to rest against yours. The two of you stood like that for a moment. Just that. Just the warmth and the weight of it. The almost unbearable relief of being, finally, in one place and in one truth at the same time. No calculation. No management. Just this. He pulled back just enough to see your face. His eyes were bright with something that had no appropriate name in the language of 1340 England. But you knew what it was. You had known it in your own chest for months without allowing yourself to call it by its name. He kissed you once. Just once. Softly, without hurry, the fire at your backs and the empty afternoon around you. And it was the simplest thing you had ever done, and also the most true. And then, footsteps. You stepped apart before the thought fully formed. The instinct was immediate and absolute. The reflex of a lifetime of vigilance. You were already reaching for your tools by the time the steps reached the door. Harwick filled the doorway. His good clothes from the manor visit. His expression impossible to read, as always. But something moving underneath it that was not what you were braced for. His eyes moved across the forge. The fire. The bench. You. Aldric. He stopped. The silence was complete. And you waited for what you had always known would eventually come. The ruin. The end of the structure. The consequences you had calculated and feared and built your entire careful life around preventing. It did not come. What came instead was something far more complicated and far more unexpected. Harwick looked at you both for a long, still moment. The expression on his face moved through several things at once. Too many for you to isolate them. And then the one that surfaced and stayed, that pushed everything else to the edges, was not rage, was not condemnation, was not the thing you had prepared for. It was pain, an old pain, a recognized pain, the kind of pain that belongs to someone who has carried a similar weight for a very long time. His shoulders dropped, almost imperceptibly. Something in the line of his face, some habitual tension, released. And for just a moment, beneath all of it, you saw something that looked unmistakably like recognition. He walked to his station. He took his apron from its hook. He put it on slowly, adjusting the ties with his large, careful hands. And then he picked up his hammer and went back to work without a single word. The forge resumed its sounds around you. Aldric picked up his tools after a moment. Then you. The fire burned. The afternoon moved. No one spoke. But the silence was entirely different from any silence that had existed in this building before. It was not the silence of secret. It was not the silence of shame. It was the silence of three men in a room where something had just become true that had not been true before, and none of them yet knew what to do with it. But all three of them understood that there was no going back to what it was. That evening, as the fire was banked, the tools were hung, and the work of the day was packed away, Harwick spoke. He was at the east window, his back to you both, looking out at the village, going about the business of evening. Lamps being lit, the last customers of the market day gathering their purchases, the smell of cook fires beginning to drift from the houses. He did not turn when he spoke. There are things a man carries, he said, in a voice that was quieter than his usual one, for so long that he forgets they are heavy. Neither of you spoke. There was nothing to say yet. This was his moment to say what he was going to say. Eleanor knew. A pause. She knew things about me that I never put into words, and she held those things with a grace that I have spent the last 2 years trying to understand. It was not common. Not a common thing at all. Another pause, longer. She did not require that I explain myself fully. She simply saw me, and held what she saw without using it against me. I have never properly accounted for what a gift that was, until she was gone. The fire settled. The light through the window was the long golden light of late August evenings. I am not a young man, Harwick continued. I have lived 52 years in this skin, and I know what it costs to be known, truly known. And I know also what it costs to spend a life being known only partially. I have made both choices at different times. I know the weight of each. He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice was lower still. I remember what it is, and I remember it well. To stand in a room and feel a thing you could not name and have nowhere in the world to put it safely. I remember that feeling very well, Edmund. He used your name, only yours, and you understood. Suddenly, with a kind of vertigo, why? He turned from the window. In the evening light, his face was open in a way that you had never seen it. Stripped of the authority that usually lived there, stripped of the distance, down to something that was simply a man who had seen something and been seen in return. He looked at you both for a long, quiet moment. Go home, he said. Rest well. Come back tomorrow. That was all. You left. You and Aldric walked out into the evening separately, a few feet apart, as you always did, as you had to. The village sounds gathered around you. Dogs, cartwheels, voices. The first stars were appearing above the rooftops, pale in the still light sky. You walked your separate roads. But something was different now, and you could feel it in your body. Not fear, or not only fear. Something that was its opposite, or perhaps its companion. Something that you could not name with any of the words the world had given you, but that lived, that warm and uncertain and impossibly real, somewhere in the middle of your chest. Tomorrow. Tomorrow you would go back to the forge, and nothing between the three of you would ever be exactly what it had been before this day. And the question of what it might instead become, what it was possible for it to become in this time, in this place, between these three men who had each been carrying something heavy for a very long time, was a question that hung in the August air, unanswered and alive, the way the best questions always do. Did this story stay with you tonight? Tell me. You do not sleep, not properly. You lie beside Margaret, and you listen to the house settle around you. The creak of the beam above the door, the wind finding the gap beneath the window shutter. The particular silence of a village that has gone to bed, not knowing what happened inside Harwick's forge today. The world outside is indifferent and ordinary, and you find it both a relief and a kind of affront. You go over it again. The way the afternoon felt, the quality of the air in the forge when you were alone in it. Aldric's voice saying your name, the sound of footsteps on the path, Harwick in the doorway, his face. You keep returning to his face. You had expected many things from that face. You had prepared, in some wordless and animal part of yourself, for the worst version of it, the version that meant the end of something. Instead, you had seen something that you did not have a clean word for, even now, alone in the dark of your own bedroom. Pain, yes. Recognition, yes. But also something that looked almost like relief. Why would a man be relieved by what Harwick saw today? You do not have an answer, but the question keeps you awake until the first birds begin. And then you get up while Margaret is still sleeping, and you dress in the dark, and you walk through the empty village in the last of the night. And you arrive at the forge before dawn. You are not surprised to find that you are not the first. Aldric is there already. He is sitting on the bench just inside the door, not working, not pretending to work, just sitting, his elbows on his knees, his hands loose between them, looking at the cold hearth. He looks up when you come in, and for a moment, neither of you speaks. This is a different kind of silence from the ones you have shared before. It is not comfortable, and it is not exactly uncomfortable. It is the silence of two men who are standing at the edge of a territory neither of them has mapped. You couldn't sleep either. You say. Not much, no. He looks at you steadily. Are you? He stops, reconsiders. How are you? You think about this seriously, because that is how you think about most things. I don't know yet, you answer. Ask me again in an hour. That earns a small, unguarded sound from him. Not quite a laugh, but close. Something honest. And just like that, the worst of the tension breaks. And the two of you are left with whatever comes after it. You build the fire together. It is something you have done hundreds of times. The laying of the wood, the coaxing of the tinder, the watching of the first small flame take hold and begin to grow. But this morning it feels different in a way you cannot fully articulate, as though each small, ordinary action is simultaneously itself and also a declaration of something. We are still here. We came back. We are building this fire again. What do you think he meant? Aldric asks, when the fire is established and you are both warming your hands at the edges of it. He doesn't need to say who he means. I think he meant more than he said. That's not hard. He said very little. No. You watch the fire climb. But what he said about carrying things, about Eleanor knowing. Aldric nods. He has been thinking about this too. You can see it in the particular focus in his face, the way he looks when a problem has been turning in his mind for hours. He wasn't condemning us, Aldric says carefully. No. He was doing something else. I couldn't tell exactly what. Neither could I. You pause, but I think we'll find out today. You look at each other. The fire between you is warm and real. Outside, the village is beginning to wake. Harwick arrives at his usual hour. He looks exactly the same as always. The same broad frame filling the doorway, the same deliberate, unhurried movements, the same quality of attention he brings to everything. That way of entering a space as though he has already assessed it from the outside. He hangs his cloak on its hook. He surveys the work laid out from yesterday. He does not acknowledge the previous day at all. Not directly, not with words. But there is something in the way he moves through the morning's work that is subtly different, though you would struggle to name the precise mechanism of the difference. He is no less authoritative, no less precise. But there is something, a quality of deliberate presence, as though he is choosing to be here rather than simply inhabiting the habit of being here, which is a distinction that means everything and is very difficult to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. You work through the morning in your normal pattern. Iron becomes other things. The fire does what fire does. The three of you move through the shared vocabulary of the craft. The shorthand gestures, the understood rhythms, the moments of coordination between bodies that come from years of working in the same space. And underneath all of it, something is building. Not a storm, something more like the feeling before a storm. The pressure, the stillness, the quality of air that is different from regular air. At midday, Harwick sets down his hammer. He looks at the two of you for a moment. "Come," he says. He takes you to the back of the forge, behind the main working area, through the low door that leads to the storage room and the small covered space beyond it where deliveries are received. It is quieter here. The sounds of the street are muffled. There is a rough bench against the wall and a window that looks onto the alley between the forge and the stables. And the light coming through it is gray and diffuse and honest. Harwick stands in the middle of the space with his arms folded. He does not sit. Sitting, you understand, would make this more of a performance than he wants it to be. He stands, and he looks at you both for a moment, with that expression that is still difficult to read, that expression you are only beginning to understand has more history behind it than you previously knew. He uncrosses his arms. He puts his hands in his pockets. A gesture so uncharacteristic, so strangely boyish in a man of his size and gravity, that it tells you more about his state of mind than anything his face is doing. Then he begins to speak. "I was 24, he says. Younger than either of you when this story happened. Though it doesn't feel that way when I tell it to myself. It feels like something that happened to a man of full age, with full understanding. But I was 24, and I was working at a forge in Norwich, apprenticed to a man named Colston, who was the finest craftsman I've ever known." A pause. "And there was another apprentice, 3 years older than me. His name was Crispin." He says the name with the particular care of someone handling something that has been stored for a long time and might be fragile. The name sounds strange in the air of this small room. Too specific, too human, too alive for something that has lived only in private for 28 years. "We were together for 2 years, Harwick says. "Not openly. We were not foolish. Neither of us was foolish. But we were together, and we knew what we were to each other. And for 2 years, I understood something about myself and about the world that I have spent the last 3 decades carefully, not forgetting, but wrapping, covering over, packing into a part of myself that I did not visit." He stops. He looks at neither of you directly, which is unusual for him. His eyes are somewhere in the middle distance, somewhere in Norwich 28 years ago. "He was not like me," Harwick says after a moment. "In the ways that mattered for the work, we were alike, both serious, both skilled, both with a particular feeling about the craft that most men don't have, and that Colston recognized and valued. But in every other way, he was different. He was quick. He laughed easily. He talked to everyone, the way—" He stops. He glances at Aldric once, briefly, and then away. The way certain people do, as though the world owes them nothing and offers them everything anyway. A pause. I had never known anyone like that. I had been serious my entire life. I did not know what to do with someone who made the serious things feel bearable. You hear the echo of something in those words. Your own words, almost. Things you could have said about Aldric, things you never found a way to say. "Crispin left," he says finally. "He was offered a better position in London, and he took it, because that was what he should have done. And I told him so. I told him it was the right choice. I told him clearly and without wavering, and I meant it entirely. And I also understood, the morning after he left, that I had made a decision in that same moment, that I would not again allow myself to be in a position where someone else's leaving could take something essential from me. He says this without self-pity, as a man states a calculation that made sense at the time and that he has lived inside ever since. Or rather, that was when I decided it was the end of something, of that particular version of myself. He looks at you now, directly, first at Aldric, then at you. Eleanor knew, he says. She knew when she married me, not because I told her, but because Eleanor was a woman of extraordinary perception, and she saw what she saw, and she chose me anyway. And we had a good life together, Edmund. A genuinely good life. I want you to understand that. I loved her, truly and without pretense. She was the finest person I have known. But she knew there was a room in me she would never be able to enter. And she was at peace with that. Which was a grace I never fully understood until she was gone. And I understood what it feels like to walk into an empty house every evening. The gray light moves through the window. Outside, a cart passes in the alley, unhurried. When I came back early yesterday, Harwick continues, and now there is something different in his voice, something that costs him noticeably more. I stood in that doorway, and I saw the two of you, and what I felt was... He stops, starts again. The last time I felt something like that in my body was in Norwich, 24 years old, standing close enough to Crispin to smell the iron on his hands. And I stood in my own doorway, and I felt it again. And I want to be plain with you because I do not know how to be other than plain. I was not disgusted. I was not afraid. Not for myself, though I am afraid for you. Because I know what the world does with such things. What I was. He pauses for a long time. Was reminded, sharply, of being young. He says this flatly, without performance. He's not asking for pity, and he is not offering an excuse for what he's about to say next. He's simply laying out the facts, the way a good craftsman lays out his tools before, beginning a difficult piece, everything visible, nothing hidden, nothing extraneous. I am not telling you this to make a claim on anything, he says. I want that to be clear. I am your employer and your elder, and I am not a reckless man. And whatever I felt standing in that doorway is not your concern unless you choose to make it so. I am not asking you to make it so. He pauses. I am telling you this because you deserve to know that what you carry, you do not carry it alone. In this building. Another pause. Not entirely. And because keeping one more secret in this forge seemed yesterday, like one more than I was willing to keep. Silence. You look at Aldric. He is looking at Harwick with an expression that is doing several things at once, absorbing, recalibrating, something in his eyes that is the specific gentleness he saves for the things that matter most. How long have you been carrying it alone? Aldric asks. Harwick looks at him. Since Norwich, he says. Since I was 27. Aldric nods slowly. He doesn't do anything dramatic with that answer. He doesn't make a gesture of it or turn it into a speech. He just receives it and holds it, the way he holds everything that is given to him with genuine care. That's a long time, he says. Yes, says Harwick. It is. A beat. Then Aldric says, well, you're not carrying it alone anymore, if that's useful. It comes out simply, without fanfare, the way the truest things tend to come out. Harwick looks at him for a long, still moment. Yes, he says finally, in a voice that is not quite steady. It is. The afternoon is different after that. Not lighter exactly. It would be wrong to say lighter, because what was said was heavy, and heavy things don't simply lift. But something in the architecture of the forge has shifted. The three of you move through the work with the same hands, the same tools, the same fire. But the space itself is changed. The way a room is changed after a confession. Larger in some sense, even though nothing about the walls has moved. Harwick works with the same authority he has always worked with. But there is a quality to his silence now that is different from the silence of before. It is not sealed. It has cracks in it. And through the cracks you can see something that looks almost like relief. At one point, late in the afternoon, he looks up from the piece he is shaping and watches Aldric work for a moment. The easy efficiency of him, the way he talks to the metal as he works, a habit so ingrained he probably doesn't know he does it anymore. And something crosses Harwick's face that is barely there and gone almost before you can catch it. But you catch it. You have always been a noticer of things. It is not lust. It is older and more complicated than lust. It is the expression of a man looking at something and recognizing it from a great distance. The way you might look at a landscape you visited once when you were young and had not expected to see again. You look away before he can see you looking. Thursday passes. Friday arrives. 1 week since the afternoon that changed everything. Harwick is away again, this time to settle a debt with a supplier from the eastern counties. He will be gone all day, he says, perhaps into the evening. He does not look at either of you when he says it. You understand this is deliberate. You are not certain what to do with that understanding, but you hold it carefully. The morning alone with Aldric feels different from last Friday. Last Friday was the edge of something. The first step off a cliff taken without fully deciding to step. This is something that has already happened, that already exists in the world. That you are both now standing inside rather than looking toward. You work. You talk. At some point, you could not say exactly when. The talking becomes easier than it has ever been. Not because the stakes are lower. The stakes, if anything, are higher. But because you have passed through the door now, and on this side of it, something is different. Some pressure that has been constant for so long you had stopped feeling it as pressure and started feeling it simply as the normal quality of being alive. That pressure is gone. Or not gone, but lessened. Bearable in a new way. I've been thinking about what Harwick said, Aldric says around mid-morning. I have too. About Crispin, 24 years old, Norwich. He pauses. Do you think he ever wondered what became of him? I think a man doesn't mention someone by name after 28 years, unless that person never fully left. Aldric is quiet with this for a moment. He's alone every night, he says. Goes home to that house and there's no one. He carried all of that, all those years, and even the woman who knew and chose him anyway is gone now. You don't respond. You are both thinking about the same thing. The specific texture of that particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of being known only partially, of having a part of yourself that has no witness. We should not, you start. No, Aldric agrees immediately, understanding what you were going to say. We should not pity him. He would not want that. No, he wouldn't. But we could. He stops himself too, working through the thought. We could let him be less alone in it, without making it something it isn't, without asking anything of him. He looks at you. Just let him know the door's open, even a little. You think about this. He already opened it himself, you say finally, by telling us. Yes. Aldric looks at the fire. I think that's the bravest thing I've ever seen a man do. You think about Harwick at 24, in a forge in Norwich, with someone he loved, and then alone for 27 years with the knowledge of it. You think about Eleanor, perceptive and gracious, holding her husband's whole self without demanding it be smaller. You think about the particular kind of courage it takes to love well in any direction. But especially this one, especially here, especially now, in this century, in this world. You set down your tools. You walk to where Aldric is standing. He looks at you. In his face is everything that has been building for 3 years and 8 months, and all the particular morning light of this day, and the fact of what was said in this building yesterday, and the fact of what is possible now that was not possible before. You put your hand against the side of his face, the way he did to you the Friday before. You feel him lean into it. What you have with each other in those hours is not a simple thing. It is not the frantic urgency of a secret that has been kept too long and is finally escaping. It is not something performed for its own sake or grasped at because it is available. It is something quieter than that and more substantial. The particular intimacy of two people who have been circling each other for years and have finally allowed the circling to become something with a center. You learn the geography of him slowly, with the attentiveness that you bring to all things you care about. The specific warmth at the back of his neck, just below where his hair ends. The way his breathing shifts, subtly but unmistakably, when you are within a certain distance of him. The line of his jaw and the particular quality of light this morning puts through the forge windows. He is not a beautiful man, in the way the songs mean when they say beautiful. But he is specific. He is exactly himself in a way that is more valuable than any conventional beauty. And you have spent 3 years cataloging the exactness of him without admitting that was what you were doing. He learns you in return. He approaches you the way he approaches everything, with attention that is complete without being consuming, the way good company makes you feel seen without making you feel observed. He has a careful quality when he touches you, not tentative but considered, as though each gesture is chosen rather than simply allowed. You are unused to being chosen. You have spent your entire adult life being endured or managed or, at best, respected from a professional distance. Being chosen, having someone approach you with warmth and intention and specific attention to you as a person rather than a function, is something you did not know you were missing until this moment makes its absence undeniable. You stand in the forge with the fire behind you, and you understand that this is what you have been protecting yourself from, and also what you have been desperately, quietly, hoping for your entire adult life. There is a moment in the middle of all of this where the two of you stop and simply look at each other. Just that. No particular reason to stop, no particular reason to look. Only the reality of being here, in this place, in this impossible year with this person. He has laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, you notice? Deep ones, the kind that take years to earn. You find this inexplicably, almost too much to hold. You're staring, he says. His voice is warm and low. I know, you say. You don't stop. He shakes his head slightly, still smiling, and pulls you in by the front of your shirt, not urgently, not desperately, simply surely, the way you do something you have decided to do and are not second-guessing. And you go. You go without calculation or management or the careful weighing of risk that has governed almost every significant decision of your life. You simply go because this is where you are, and this is who is asking, and for once for once in your careful and disciplined and well-defended life. You allow the simple fact of what you want to be enough reason. He pulls back at some point and looks at you with that particular expression, the one that contains everything, and says very simply, "You are not what you allow people to see." "No," you agree. "I know," he says. "I've known for a long time." And then, quieter, "Thank you for letting me." You don't have words for what that does to the inside of you. So you don't speak. You press your forehead to his, the way you did last week. And you both stay there in the silence of the forge, in the smell of iron and wood smoke and the particular light of this particular day. And you let yourself simply be in it, without calculating it or managing it or looking for the fastest route back to somewhere safer. For the first time in a very long time, you are not interested in safe. Harwick comes back while the light is still good. He sees you both at your stations, working, composed, unremarkable, the forge going about its business. His eyes move between you once, and whatever he reads and what he sees makes him turn to his own work without comment. But later, as the day is closing and the three of you are gathered, near the banked fire in that particular moment of the end of a working day, when a man can say something he couldn't quite say earlier, Harwick clears his throat and reaches into his coat and sets something on the workbench between you. It is a small flask, battered and old. He does not explain its provenance. "Eleanor made this at the end of last winter," he says. "Plum spirit. She made too much of it, which was her habit." He pauses. "I've been keeping it because I couldn't think of the right occasion to open it. And then she died, and there were no more occasions. For a while." He looks at the flask for a moment. "I think she would have found this a satisfactory occasion." He opens the flask and pours it into 3 tin cups that he takes from the shelf without ceremony. You take your cup. Aldric takes his. The three of you stand around the cooling fire with Eleanor's plum spirit in your hands. And you are, all three of you, more honest with each other than you have been with almost anyone else in your lives. You are also more exposed and more in danger and more aware of the impossibility of what you are standing in the middle of. The year is 1340. England does not provide a language for this. The Church certainly does not. The law provides only punishments. And yet, here you are. You raise your cup slightly. Harwick does the same. After a moment, Aldric does too. Nothing is said, because there is nothing adequate to say, and you have all three learned, by different routes, that silence used correctly is not emptiness, but precision. You drink. The spirit is sweet and warm and burns just a little on the way down, the way the best things do. In the weeks that follow, things settle into a new shape, not dramatically, not in any way that the village could see or would suspect or would have words for, even if they did. From the outside, Harwick's forge continues to operate as it always has. The orders come in, the work gets done, the iron becomes what it is needed to become. And three men go home in the evening and say nothing in particular to the people waiting for them. But inside the forge, the air is different. Harwick talks more, not much more. He is constitutionally a man of few words, and the architecture of his personality is not going to be rebuilt in a month. But occasionally, without warning, he will say something about Crispin, a detail, a memory, something small and specific that he offers the way he offered the flask of plum spirit, without preamble, as though he is simply handing something over and trusting that it will be received. He talked once about the way Crispin laughed. Apparently, he had an unusual laugh, high and startled, as though he was always slightly surprised by what he found funny. And this had charmed Harwick unreasonably. He mentioned this with the very faint trace of a smile that was gone almost as soon as it appeared. Aldric received this information with his usual quality of attention, and you watched Harwick's face when Aldric asked a follow-up question. Something small, something curious, and you saw what happened there. That almost imperceptible loosening, that quality of relief that comes when you have handed something fragile to someone and they haven't dropped it. You understand this better than you can say. You have been that person too now. The one someone trusted with their fragile thing. There is an evening in September when you stay late at the forge. A rush order, a night's commission, new fittings needed before the journey south. Harwick sends word to his house that he won't be back until dark. The three of you work by firelight, the night pressing against the windows, and the intimacy of it is different from the daytime intimacy. Softer, more unguarded. Aldric starts singing at some point. He does this occasionally, a habit from his northern years, songs that came with the work, rhythms that matched the hammering. You have always pretended not to listen to this, and failed completely. Harwick, to your surprise, begins to hum along with part of it. A melody that must belong to the same tradition, the same northernness. And Aldric looks up with genuine delight. You know this one? I knew a version of it, Harwick says, not quite meeting his eyes. Where from? A pause. Norwich, he says. Aldric's expression does something careful and kind. Sing it then, he says. Your version. And Harwick, who has not voluntarily performed anything in front of anyone in what must be years, sings the second half of the verse. His voice is lower than you expected and rougher, shaped by age and disuse, and it is also, without question, the most human sound you have ever heard him make. When it ends, you all three sit with it for a moment. Crispin taught you that, Aldric says. It isn't a question. Yes. Aldric nods. Nothing more. You look at Harwick's face in the firelight, and you see a man who has been alone for a very long time, in a very particular way. A man who has been loved, and who has loved, and who has also been carrying something for 28 years that had nowhere to go, and who is only now, at 52 years old, in a forge in the village of Ashford, with two men who have their own secrets, beginning to set it down. You think about what it is to be known, being late, to find a witness after decades of not having one. You think about Eleanor, who saw him and chose him and never required him to be smaller. You think about Aldric 3 feet away from you, warm and real, the fire in his eyes. You think about yourself, the man you have been, the walls you built, the room inside you that has been locked for so long. You understand, for the first time, that the room is open now. You didn't decide to open it. It opened because of what other people brought toward it, patience and attention, and the specific kind of courage that shows up not as loudness, but as a willingness to tell the truth in a low voice, and wait to see if someone tells the truth back. You think about the word that the world would use for what you are, the words the church would use, the words the law would use. And then you look at these two men, one who sang you into belonging, and one who showed you what it costs to carry something alone for half a lifetime. And you think that whatever the world's words are, the world has never once accounted for what this actually is. The specific texture of it, the way it feels to be in a room where you are simply, uncomplicatedly yourself. The world has no sufficient word for this? Perhaps that is all right. Perhaps some things are too real to need a word. On a Sunday in late September, when the village is at the church, and the forge stands empty, and you have the rare, almost illicit luxury of being nowhere you are needed. You come to the forge anyway. You don't plan to. You find yourself there the way you sometimes find yourself in the middle of something you needed without knowing you needed it. Not walked towards, but fallen into, simply the way you fall into sleep. You sit on the bench inside the door, and you look at the cold hearth, and you think about the year that is behind you, and the shape it has taken, and what it has added to you that you did not have before. You think about Aldric, who is home with his children today, who will be at the forge tomorrow, who carries his own complexity and his own impossibility, and also this brightness that he brings into every space, that specific quality of warmth that you have stopped trying to file away under something safer and have simply allowed yourself to need. You think about Harwick, who is presumably alone in his house, who has Eleanor's absence everywhere and Crispin's memory decades deep, who sang a verse of an old song in the firelight last Tuesday, and who you can see, now that you know how to look, is a man who still wants to be in the world, still wants to be present, still wants to matter to someone, even at 52, even through the grief and the long, careful silence. You think about what this could be. The three of you. Not what the world would call it. Not what the law would recognize or the church would permit. Something that has no name in any language currently spoken in England. Something that lives in the specific temperature of a forge, in a half-shared song. In the way a man's hand rests on your jaw, like you are something worth holding carefully. Something that costs everything and gives back more. You have been a careful man your entire life. You have calculated and managed and built walls and chosen survival over and over again. And you are not going to stop being careful. Careful is how you stay alive. Careful is how all three of you stay alive. And you understand this with complete clarity. The world has not become safer. The church has not changed its mind. The law remains what it is. But you are also, for the first time in your life, not only surviving, there is something else happening alongside the surviving. Something that gets up in the morning and walks toward the forge not only out of habit, but out of genuine desire to be there. Something that is learned, late and carefully, and at considerable cost, that being known is worth the terror of it. You sit in the empty forge in the September light, and the cold hearth is cold, and the tools hang silent on their hooks, and you have never in your life felt less alone. The village of Ashford does not know what lives inside the forge at the junction of its two busiest roads. It does not know about the plum spirit or the song from Norwich, or the way two men learned each other in the August heat, or the things said in the storage room at the back of the building. It does not know, and it will not know, because the three of you are not reckless, and because the world is what it is, and because some things are protected precisely by their silence. But Ashford knows, in the way a village knows things without knowing it knows them, that Harwick Dunmore seems different this autumn, less sealed, less like a monument standing in its own shadow. He stops sometimes to speak to people in the market, which he did not use to do. He answers when asked how he is with something other than one word. A woman who has known him for 20 years remarks to her neighbor that he seems more like himself than he has in years. Which is a strange thing to say, but which everyone who hears it immediately understands. No one can explain it. That is fine. Some explanations are for the people inside them, not for the people outside. There is one last thing. At the end of September, when the leaves on the road outside the forge have started to turn and the morning carries the first real edge of autumn, you arrive early, as you have been arriving, and you find Harwick there ahead of you. This is unusual. Harwick arrives at his usual hour, always, without variation. But this morning he is there, standing at the workbench with a piece of parchment in his hand and an expression you cannot immediately categorize. He hears you come in and looks up. He holds out the parchment. You take it. You read it. It is a letter. Old by the look of the paper, the ink faded to a gray-brown that means years, maybe decades. The handwriting is careful and even, and belongs to someone who was not a natural writer, but who meant every word precisely enough to write it carefully. You read it slowly. It is a letter from Crispin. Written, the date at the top suggests, in the year Harwick was 31, 7 years after Norwich. It is short. It says only that he thinks about their time together, that he has built a life in London that is as good as he could make it, that he is not unhappy, but that there are certain things a man cannot put down, no matter how long he carries them, and that he hopes, wherever Harwick is, that he has found something that makes the wait worthwhile. It ends with his name, only his name, and nothing else. You look up from the letter. You look at Harwick. He is watching you read, and his face is open in the way it has been learning this autumn to be open. Not fully, not easily, but more than before, which is more than enough. Did you ever write back? You ask. No, he says. Do you know where he is now? No. A pause. I kept the letter, Harwick says. It is not an explanation. It is just a fact. He kept it for 21 years, folded in the same fold marks, in whatever private place a man keeps the things he cannot look at often, but cannot bring himself to put away. You hold the letter out to him. He takes it back. He folds it along its old lines. He puts it in his coat. You stand there for a moment, the two of you, in the first light of the morning, with the fire needing to be built and the day needing to begin and the whole ordinary apparatus of life waiting to reassert itself as it always does, regardless of what the night before it contained. He was right, you say. Harwick looks at you. What he wrote, you say. About there being things you can't put down, he was right. Harwick is quiet for a moment. And then, with great care, he says, yes, he was. You build the fire. Aldric arrives 20 minutes later, shaking the first autumn rain from his coat, already talking before he's fully through the door. Something about his daughter and the chickens and a new development in that long-running comedy. And the forge fills up with the sound of him. And Harwick makes a small, unmistakable sound that you have never heard from him before, something low and brief and involuntary that could only be described as fond. You meet Aldric's eyes across the forge. He sees it too. You can tell. He doesn't make a thing of it. He just finishes his story and picks up his tools, and the fire burns, and the three of you get to work, carrying your impossible and specific and unnamed thing into another day. The iron waits. The world continues. And in the forge at the junction of Ashford's two busiest roads, something is alive that has no word in this language, in this century, in this difficult and ungenerous world. Something that is, despite everything and against all reasonable probability, simply love. Thank you for being here. On the other side of the story, in this place where the fuller version lives, If Edmund's walls speak to you, if Harwick's letter speaks to you, if Aldric's brightness speaks to you, you know where to find us. Every month, more stories. Every month, another door left open. This is simple gay love, and you belong here.
Enjoyed this story? Good, because I have so much more to tell you, but those other ones I can't put out here. It's not for everyone. It's for those who really want to go deep. On my Patreon, the stories are more intense, more free, more real. No censorship, no filter, no limitations. It's the place where I can truly explore everything these characters live, feel, and desire. Things that don't make it out here. And trust me, there's a lot waiting for you. And it's not just content, it's a community. A closed space for those who want real representation, who want to support the LGBTQ+ cause and have access to benefits nobody else has. Early content, behind the scenes, stories only members get to know, and a group of people who think just like you. A place where we can talk about everything, without judgment, without limits. There are already a lot of people inside following stories you don't even know exist yet. And every month, there's something new coming. Getting in is easy. Point your phone camera at the QR code on screen right now, or use the link in the first pinned comment down below, or in the video description. In less than 2 minutes, you're already part of it. See you on the other side.